Okay, and just to start off the discussion, I would like to, again, always bring this around to the 3D virtual cell and the proposed project to bring it together. There are a lot of really impressive things here in terms of the education and dissemination, and as I think Lucilla said, I think we've moved beyond a model where everyone has to use one thing, but that there in fact now are a whole palette of things, some of them partially overlapping, but some of them duplicative. But as I like to say, we don't have one shirt manufacturer, we don't have one car manufacturer, we don't have one anything. We can support, as long as the market will support, many different models. But one thing I have sort of noticed is, based on that little slide I showed of 3 different interfaces, is it possible in this idea of an app store to sort of make things sort of work more or less the same way? We don't like, we'll support 50 cars, but we don't want every car to be different so that I have to learn 50 different ways of driving, right? That there's some similarities to things. And it seems to me if the idea of an app store is going to work, there has to be some of those sorts of things in there. It's not just uniformity of protocols, but uniformity of use, so to speak.
I agree, and I think you can't have just one way of doing things, because otherwise it won't work. There are data sets that require more protection. There are data sets that are so large you can't move them anyways. So there are different things going on that we, again, researching the different ways of addressing those problems. It has been a very interesting journey.
I would submit that we shouldn't necessarily take a very top-down approach to that question. So cars arrived at their common interface through a lot of trial and error over many years. And I think we're at a state of time where there's a diversity of solutions, and there's an increasing literacy when it comes to computational sciences. And hopefully, the general population will have a much higher level of literacy in 10 years. And I think we're in this transition period. I feel like I'm in transition because I'm sort of a person who's in between many different fields, and I feel like we are going to reach a point in literacy where we can figure this out, and that we shouldn't try to impose standards too stringently at this early point in time because we don't understand the problems well enough. And that's why, for instance, with us, we've just taken a very pragmatic approach. We just have software engineers. We're not even computer scientists. We're just going to try to build solutions. Treat it like a Silicon Valley startup in a way.
So I'm not sure. I don't think you actually asked an actual question, right? But
Yep.
but I'll say something as well.
Yes.
I think it's on the first day, the first question someone asked was, what is this 3D virtual cell for? And I think if it has a hope in hell of succeeding, we need to be very clear on that. And I can understand, there might be different reasons to have such a project. So is it primarily to connect existing research? Is it like a coat hanger, which allows you to branch out and to look at and to compare different things that are already done? Or is it primarily an educational tool or a place to do outreach and education? Or is it really going to enable new science? And I think those are just 3, and I'm sure everybody here can come up with 10 others, but those are 3 different goals. But it probably you want to know where you're going or what you're doing
Right.
before you know how to get there. And then I think it's true. There are many efforts, and everybody's happy. I think some of the morning talks we saw, beautiful cross-domain efforts to connect things. So the wiring and the plumbing is all there, but what's the main point here? And it's important that's I think scoped well. So I don't know if anybody has an answer.
I think we're trying to figure that out partially, but the idea that there was an app store was, if you read the original materials, was in there, and that was brought up the first day. So it's like, well, what would that actually be?
Right, and what is it for?
Yes, what is it for? I think that's important.
The App Store keeps coming up and up again, but I just want to say that Apple did not build or create this App Store environment out of the goodness of their heart. For them, it was clear financial model with benefits. And thinking like that does not exist in science. For a PI, it's easier to get a grad student to do the job and start a project from the beginning, crank up the code and get a software to get things done, rather than go somewhere and find out the solutions and fix. And maybe has a little steeper learning curve and more investment, but ultimately Scientists don't think that way. They don't look for financial benefits or outcomes in terms of reading papers and things like that. Right?
Questions from the audience?
So I actually want to make a comment in this context about the importance of NIF, right?
Oh, well, thank you.
Yes. Well, no. And things like NIF. And things like NIF.
Things
and
like NIF, that
full,
is fair.
All right. And full disclosure, our project is partly funded by NIF, for which we are very grateful. And I think, if you go back to the dawn of experimental science, the reason that we have a publications ecosystem is because people would gather in places, the Royal Society in places like that, the French Academy of Sciences, and they would actually conduct the experiments in a room where everybody could see what was going on and talk to the people that built the equipment. Robert Hooke, being the curator of experiments for the Royal Society, was responsible for building most of the equipment that people asked him to build. He had extensive networks of collaborators who were kind of 17th century industrial people. When he built the air pump for Boyle's experiments, he consulted with the guy who built the pumps to drain the fens, right? So all of that stuff, if you're in the room, you know what's there, you know who built it, you know how to get in touch with them and talk to them. And you're also hanging out in these coffee houses, right, where you talk to these people. So why is an app store useful? App stores are useful because it's a catalog of things that you can download and use, right? I think NIF and similar efforts are equal in importance, actually, or will be shown over time to be equal in importance to PubMed, because without them, you cannot say what thing you actually used, whether it's software or a reagent or whatnot, to do this experiment, and what was it, how was it built, what is the role in the experiment, and how do you get it, right? So I just want to throw that out there. I think there's a generalization across the idea of an app store that goes to all of these registries of things and places to find them and use them.
Can I make a
Absolutely.
quick comment? So I think NIF is great too. I think what is still not there is this way of even thinking or talking or vocabulary of looking at, in some semi-formal way, what is the outcome of an experiment. So I think if you have the data on the one hand and then you have the paper on the other hand, the data is clearly too granular, too specific, I would say, for anybody except the person who has created or somebody who invests a significant amount of time and effort to look at the raw data and say something about it. The paper, on the other hand, is, as Tim and I have often talked about, and it's a story. So I mean, a paper is a story that persuades with data. The point of your paper is to tell your story and get your point across, and you use data for that. So a paper is perhaps too narrative. A paper is in natural language. It's hard to parse, etc. So I think that there is all the things where we're talking about where we really want to integrate the information from different experiments and different types of experiments. So you want to compare the wet lab stuff to the computational stuff, or you want to compare one model to another model. You need this sort of intermediary level of description that is perhaps semi-formal, and I don't know, maybe it can be expressed in triples or not, but you need some level where you say, okay, this is what was done. I think that's describable, and the language is there to talk about the methodology. We're not quite there, but that can probably be reached. But then the outcome, how that is described, I think that's a level where, if you had that, that'd be great, because then you could say 5 experiments gave it a 6 and 2 others gave it a 1. I think that level of agreement, that's what seems to be missing. So a level of being able to talk of something in between the paper and the data that would be at the level of the experiment, perhaps. I'm just throwing this out there. A lot of you know more about this than I do, so I'd be very interested in lots of people's... Sure. I think you have to stand in front of the mic, though.
No, I would just tweak the thing about the paper as a story to say it's a little bit more like a travel log, right? I took this trip, right? And I went to St. Petersburg, right? So that if other people think it's a cool place, they can go there too and replicate some of those experiences or tweak them.
Right.
I would suggest a different metaphor than the App Store, is GitHub. Because you have access to the source code, you can clone a repository, you can run the source code. An example I can think of is the D3JS GitHub project, which is a very prolifically used JavaScript library for doing active graphics on the web. And it has a beautiful wiki associated, GitHub built-in wiki capability. And so you can have that narrative alongside the actual accessible source code. And I think, right now, I think apps is hardening things too much already. And I think GitHub is that intermediate place where you have access to source code and it's still, in process and it's version tagged. So you can, you can say, okay, when I publish my Nature paper, this is version 1.0, but fork the project and you can create 1.5.
Go ahead. Did you have something?
I'm sorry. I just want to say my problem with both the App Store and the GitHub paradigm is that neither apps nor files in GitHub need to work together. And I have a feeling that the goal here is that these things are actually interacting. But maybe I'm getting this wrong. But I think.
But I think that is an
if
important
that's the
thing. It's a
case,
hub and
then-
spoke model, and that would
Right.
certainly be something for the 3D VC, right? This is the platform where all the hub and spokes work. An ecosystem is not that, right? An ecosystem means that and this is why people have brought up the idea of frameworks. It's like, you guys are doing whatever you're going to do, but we know that there's a framework in which these things are going to be reported so that, again, they can be found, accessed, and used. And, that's the diversity that we see out there. And it's not that we have one thing that does it. It's just that they all recognize at some level that if they're meant to pool their information, as opposed to the Washington, D.C. subway line where I have I have something, I get that, I can see it. I can link it to restaurants if I want, but really I go there because I want to learn that. I have no desire to compare it to other subway systems or anything else because I'm in Washington, right? So I do think that was a nice travel metaphor there. So I think, but I do think this is one of the things that needs to be addressed by everybody. Is this the right model? And we're hearing that, well, it is one of many models, and there's probably something, but that's not going to solve everything. Steve? Yeah.
List what the different models are and what you like about them. I think there are things about apps that are very powerful. Regardless of what they do, they all install the same way. You don't have to learn 50 different ways to install
Yes.
them. You configure them the same way. And that's very easy, and that's why I think people are attracted to that kind of concept. But, there are limitations as well. So maybe
That's right.
go through like GitHub or an apps model and just list what you like and then see what falls out.
So I'd like to turn this, I think that these are, again, important points for everyone to consider. But I also would like to turn this to the education committee. Oh, there's another one. Sorry, Nick, I'm good.
So
You get blinded
people have
by
been
the
using
lights.
analogies about app stores and GitHub and all of that in a lot of scientific communities.
Mm-hmm.
And there are two issues with using such analogies because it sort of fools you into thinking that you have a solution there. App Store exists because there is an iPhone.
True.
There is no iPhone for science.
An Android.
The second issue is around incentives.
Mm-hmm.
The App Store exists to make money for the person who owns the platform and the people who write the apps. Now, if you transfer this to science, well, there's no money to be made, so then what is the incentive? If you look at the ratio of people who write apps versus the people who consume apps, it will be 1:10,000, 1:50,000, or something like that. For most scientific products, you don't even get close to that ratio. And so you don't really have an incentive system to build on that one person produces and 50,000 people use it. And so these kinds of things, I think they create a false sense of structure for thinking about these problems, and we fool ourselves into thinking that it's a technology problem rather than it's an incentive problem.
It
Well,
always comes back to that.
I would just react to that statement because there are many companies who serve small communities, scientific community, journals being one of them, but also, ingenuity companies like that. They serve a small, Affymetrix when it started was a small community and it enlarged. So I don't think it is the size of the community or the ratio of the community it's serving, because it's not 99 cents either that you're charging for these things. But I agree with the incentives, but I think we can turn those incentives around. I mean, if you think about it, if the incentives have been citations in high impact factor journals, maybe they, the data citations, as some have advocated, will come to that, or software citations, which they happen because people publish about the software and so on. So I think in a way the paradigms are useful, because also, again, with the GitHub example, there's a whole large community of biologists who don't want to know how it works on the inside. They have the data. These others have done this analysis. I would like to do my analysis, see if that compares to that. And they're not source code people. I mean, they are, give me the analysis pipeline, I enter the data, and I get the results. So that's where I think there are several levels of communities out there that need to be targeted.
I would agree.
Can I add a very small, what about the metaphor of the cell for the 3D virtual cell project? I mean, the cell has, as far as I understand, again, I'm totally,
well, why would we
totally
do
out of my
that?
depth.
Yeah.
Because you have different parts of the cell, right? But they all produce things that the others consume, as far as I understand. They all have different roles, but they all need each other to stay alive, so to speak.
And
so,
other cells.
So what if in the 3D virtual cell project, for instance, you require that some or all of the information that is produced, or whatever it is that the thing produces, needs to be consumed by at least one other entity that is not the same group. And similarly, they need to consume at least one other thing that another group produces, right? If that were a requirement to participate, then you'd have to work together. Maybe it's too hard, but I think you don't want just a bunch of silos that all say their thing, and then they put their logo on the PowerPoint and they move ahead, as they were before. I mean, if you really want this interoperability, I think you have to require it from the get-go.
I would agree. I mean, in one of the projects I was at, I remember that was the first thing we asked that everybody do, is I should be able to ship you an image and you should be able to open it on your machine, and it should open with the brain oriented the correct way and not upside down and things. And it said we didn't care what tool you had. It's just that we all agreed that if you were going to be part of this, I had to be able to read your data, and you had to give me a way of doing that. But I think this brings us actually to Philip's presentation, which I thought was really, really nice. I mean, I think that this idea that I agree wholeheartedly with Lucilla that to only target people who would be in any way, shape, or form comfortable going to GitHub and doing anything is wrong in this sense, because the biologists who understand it, I like to say biologists are not inferior computer scientists. They are first-rate biologists. They know what they want to do. They know what these things mean, and they know whether you're giving them garbage or not. And they need to be able to interact with this in order to give you their wisdom to say, you are producing garbage, okay? So I think you have to have some things in different levels at which people can access this system. But there is a need, and based on the numbers you were showing me, and there are a lot of biologists, and especially graduate students or postdocs, who do want to learn the code part, and they do want to learn the bioinformatics part. And I've always felt that it was stupid that you should have to go to a university to do this and have these things set up in one university. They should be these online courses. We now have the capacity to do this. If we really want to train a generation fast, we don't wait for UCSD to approve a course and a department of X. That's just going to take a lot of time. So how, you said that, you haven't really even rolled this out yet. You had fairly impressive statistics. And one of the things with the incentives is, and this is very true in online communities, you get a little Spider-Man badge. And that's worth nothing, but again, it differentiates yourself, because I did this. I am now a Spider-Man level thing. So I just wanted you to, comment on how adaptable this model is for these different types of users.
Well, so it's a little deceptive when you see that we had 3,700 users, because a lot of that comes from like Reddit and and Slashdot, and so we got really just a huge number of like nerds. you know, not
Not
not that
users.
there's anything.
Nerds rule, that's
No,
what
not
they
that
say,
there's
right?
anything wrong
Yeah.
with that, but
Yeah.
we would like to have like 3,700 bioinformatics students or students in third world countries with no access. And we do have some really unique users. But yeah, we do need to work on the amount that we can actually get it as bioinformatics education for people who are novices. So that's sort of where we're headed with trying to integrate it into university education at the moment.
But I could see for this type of project, this being a really important component. So,
Yeah, could you imagine
Yeah.
making these interconnections between these different projects things that are tasks that your students could do? I mean, you could make the work building these connections between these 3D virtual cell components be a challenge, right? And that
Yeah.
you would get a lot of credit for, or so you would
you'd get a
pair
Spider-Man
students-
icon.
Well, you would pair students with, say, a team of,
Yeah.
or like two different groups who are trying to contribute to this whole project, and say you try to get those two to work together. I mean, if they were able to do that, that would be a great thing on their CV. They would be working directly with the groups who are producing and consuming data, and they would offer, you know, help one-on-one to these groups. So they'd be a third party to help get them to work together, maybe.
Herbert?
Actually, I mean, I've thought of a whole bunch of things now that since I first stood up
Oh,
here.
I'm sorry.
Um,
It is hard with the
The
lights.
first thing, the badge thing, we're
Yeah.
implementing that on our standards efforts because some of the journals are now willing to, they want to accept formats in standard form, you know, data in standard formats, and badges will be awarded depending on how much you comply. So
Oh.
it'll be bronze, silver, gold. So that's ongoing, and I'm just about to issue a prize actually for the best set of icons that people can come up with. We were just talking actually, going back to the apps idea, and it occurred to us, you know, you already have an app actually. It's a 18th century old app called the Paper. It just hasn't been developed very much since. So maybe the case is to develop the paper and to push it much further ahead. So embed data in the paper, make the paper live. There was a very nice publication a couple of years ago from Douglas Kell in Manchester where it was a proof of concept. They had a paper where they embedded, it was a paper on protein structure, and the images were live. You could grab the image, spin it around, have a look at the structure. The data was embedded somewhere in the paper, or there was a reference to data on some database within the paper that you could click on. So the paper became much more than this boring static thing that we normally have. So it's a case maybe of just moving the 18th century idea into the 21st century.
But
And
I-
maybe
That's-
this program could be an example to push that
that's
forward.
not
Yeah.
going far enough by a wide margin. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Right.
I mean, that Utopia can do that today, and that's great. But it's a representation of some of the data. It's not really the data and the workflow underlying it.
Oh
So-
no, the workflow would go there as well. I mean, we're looking at ways to embed a simulation workflow into a PDF. So you see the graph of the simulation. In that graph is everything you need to recreate that
Right.
that simulation
So-
using standard formats.
I didn't get to the end of my talk,
Yeah.
obviously. And so
Probably
actually,
can show you some
I
things,
wanted
yeah.
to show you
Yeah.
a demonstration of that concept where a W3 spec provenance directed graph was shown there,
Yeah.
along with all the objects related to the paper, and then housed in a Amazon AMI, so that you could just basically rerun the entire analysis. And I do think that's absolutely
Yeah.
the kind of direction we should go. And I think that's a good thought, is that maybe represents an app.
That's the app.
I
Yeah.
think that's a good use of that analysis.
So I just want to put another plug in for Beyond the PDF. That's the name, why it got its name. So there's a lot of work going on in this area. Phil was the one who did the first Beyond the PDF
That's the
at
one in Amsterdam,
UCSD.
is it? That's the one in
Yeah,
Amsterdam.
it's in Amsterdam, but
Yeah.
it will be live streamed. So
Oh, okay.
hopefully we will get people to come, because
Right.
what you see is, and I think Anita and I see this a lot, is you've got a lot of people really pushing these formats forward. You do not have the scholars themselves adopting and using these formats. And we understand that there are issues there. But I do think rethinking the optimal way of disseminating these things and not retrofitting papers essentially to do these things, because I think also that what we see is that this causes a huge time delay, a huge lag for some sorts of data to get out there. And I think the whole sort of unit and method of scholarly communication needs to not get rid of those, because our insights are really important and we want those insights in the form of a paper. But I think we have to rethink these
shouldn't
things.
shouldn't you be pushing this through the journals? Because that's what we're all used to. I go to PLOS Comp Bio, I go to this and that, that's where I go.
Oh, and they are.
But if you develop an alternative platform, I never heard of this platform.
It's new.
Well, so actually with this
I mean, is
platform,
that attached to both
Yeah.
of you? Are these attached to traditional avenues, routes where I go to get my...
so
If they're
Miles
not, I will
Axton,
not see it.
Miles
Yeah.
Axton, who's this editor of Nature Genetics, has
Yeah.
agreed, at least as the first step, to use the platform to peer review the paper, and then we're hoping we can push that beyond just reviewing it, but to actually representing, communicating. I hate the word paper,
Yeah.
but
So
I
mean,
think Peter
well,
also had
we
kind
do you want to move ahead, or
I think so, because we're running out
we
of time.
can talk more about
Yeah.
this later? 'Cause-
We have a whole conference on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter Karp, I enjoyed your presentations, and I was interested to see just kind of what are you finding as you get into these new models? How are people using it? What kind of problems are you encountering? How are you addressing them? Or maybe it's also early, you don't have that kind of
I think that
experience.
so one of the reasons I joined Force 11 is because I actually think it is time for there to be this marriage to say, what is really going to be required to us to sort of push over? And it can't be one side or the other. This idea, I'll build this really cool thing and you'll go ahead and do it, when we have paper counting, we have all these things that go on inside the universities, and very few people who are willing to put their toe in the water to say, well, I'm going to try this differently. And as I said, the young students who will use all this can't afford to do that to get their career established. The older ones already know this other system. And the problem is before, whereas we just sort of said, hey, we can do all these cool things, we now see all these examples like the Duke and others where these transparencies and things, this lack of transparency, lack of full reporting, our current way of actually doing things, is not just holding science back, it's actually doing really bad things. I mean, it's doing bad things that, independent of the fact that science is hard and we just get some things wrong, I accept all of that. I accept that we get things wrong in good faith. That was not in good faith. And this lack of reproducibility, if it's because we train scientists to be selective in what they report and not put their data out there, then we're not training scientists properly. I think it's just basically that's what it is.
But for example, what
Yeah.
alternative, what do you want to count instead of papers? I'd just like to hear a specific
There are,
proposal.
yeah, and I say we don't, so this is this whole section beyond the PDF on these alternative metrics, and I agree with Eric that these are all new right now. We don't know
Can you
what the
tell me
things
what
are.
some of the metrics are?
Data downloads, data uses,
Citations of
blogs,
data.
blog citations, use of software, number of times software has been used.
How do you count
Mentions,
use, though? How do you count software use? That's a tricky one, right?
Right, so you can only count downloads, you can't
Well, no,
Can
NIF
we
is,
use
unless people report it.
NIF is,
you
NIF is
can't
actually
count.
trying to get into the materials and methods of these papers and say who is substantively using these things, not who references them in one of those false citations, right? But who said, I used this to do this.
I mean, you could actually imagine creating a little toolkit in different programming languages that people embed in their applications that sends execution counts back to some server, right? That would actually be quite useful.
I like that idea.
That could be.
Lucille? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think the whole change in metrics and so on, I mean, it's got to come from the universities, because that's where science has been more done than anywhere else. And if the system of academic appointments and promotions does not change, it's not going to change.
Exactly. That's why I said
Well,
we
it's
have to
it's
invent
probably
this.
going to need to come from the ground up. It's not going to change until people propose viable alternatives.
Yeah, there was a good workshop last year, I believe, at Harvard on new metrics and new methods of measuring impact, which I think has a bunch of interesting ideas and thoughts about this. One concept that was there that's also coming out of the ORCID community, the people who have the single researcher ID, is the concept of microattribution, where currently you have in some journals you're required to say who did what on the paper. So this would be kind of a much stronger way of assigning credit to people. This would also, for instance, assign credit to lab techs and other people who have done work within the context of creating the experiment, and then what's the role of the PI, who actually wrote the paper. And there was a proposal for a series of microattributions. So because what Harvard was saying was, well, we get all these people with 600 publications with, citation factors. up the wazoo,
You
but
can game
what
the
did they
system.
actually do on this paper? Yeah.
Could,
So
you have could you have an
Yeah.
could you have an ontology of attributions that would
Yeah.
then
They
let
have
you
them already.
automatically
They have
They've
calculate
got
the
Amy
5.
calculations of your accounts?
Amy Brand at
Yeah.
Harvard is
Yeah.
kind of pioneering this, and I think within the ORCID community, that's what they're starting. Yeah.
Right. So we have 2 more comments, but one thing I said about taking a global view. Through NIF and Force 11, one of the things that I felt privileged to do is to stop being in my little myopic area and think I was the only one who ever thought these things. Because once you step back and say what's going on, what happens in these communities is you think, oh, wow, you should be able to do this. Once you go to Beyond the PDF, you're like, oh, wow. You know, they're already doing this in this community. There are 100 apps. There's 100 citation ontologies. I mean, again, we turn them into fields, and so you end up with all these competing standards. But there's a lot of work going on in this area.
Just a quick comment. All those new metrics, they're easy. Some of those are easy to game.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a
So
very
are
interesting
citations.
article that came out in the archive. Somebody sent it to me this week on how to game Google Scholar to up your H index. It's very simple.
Yeah. I posted that on Force 11. Phil, did you have a final comment for us?
Well, just to comment on that comment. To
Yes.
start with, I mean, there's the article level metrics work that's going on at the Public Library of Science, which has led to some open source software already. Is well aware of the gaming as being an aspect of that, but the fact of the matter is that standard citation is somewhat gamed anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there are
Saw that.
studies. I'm sorry, I wasn't here for the session, so I just came to see how you were doing. But so anyway, if you talked about that, I won't say anything. I was just going to make a comment about essentially what Lucilla was saying and the idea that we really the reward systems and that it starts at the universities. And some while ago, not a couple of years ago, I wrote this article, how to get ahead as a computational biologist in academia. And the essence of that was that you have to start by educating the people who are reviewing you. And I even put my own review letter online so people could actually see, the way I go about it. And I'm not saying it's the right way, but it's really, the fact of the matter is we're in a situation right now where most of the people reviewing the things that we're doing don't know how to do it in a quantitative way. And anything you can do to help them get to the data they need to make that evaluation is very good. So the idea that they don't know anything, they don't value software in the way they should. Anything you can show about usage of that software or the value of a data set, and the data resources, including the ones that people like Peter and I are involved with, we really should be doing a better job of making how the data is being accessed known to a larger community. So there's lots of things that could happen, but it really starts with us to start pushing our people who are reviewing us to do better. That's my point.
Change from inside the academy and outside of the academy. That's what I said. I don't think you can do this. You can't do it without it. So thank you very much for everyone's presentations. I thought this was a great session, as was the one before it. We hope you enjoyed them. It's now time for a lunch break. Please network and grab lunch. I'm reading off of this. And plenary session will resume at 1:55. We have fabulous conference organizers here.